This is episode 12 with special guest, Dr. Paul Anderson. Welcome to My Kid Cures Cancer. My name is Ryan Sternagel, former regular guy turned dadcologist, cancer coach, and health advocate. Each week we'll talk to a new expert on a particular aspect of beating cancer or human optimization to bring you one step closer on your path to true health. Thanks for spending some time with us today. Now let's dive into this valuable, life-saving information which you're not going to hear about in a mainstream hospital. Alright friends, all I can say about this episode is that if you would like to know more than the average oncologist about the mechanics of cancer, both the disease and the natural therapies to reverse it, stick around. Paul Anderson, NMD, is the CEO of Anderson Medical Group, which includes the clinic Advanced Medical Therapies, a state-of-the-art medical center providing fully compliant IV, hyperbaric, and mild hypothermia therapies. He brings over 4 decades of medical training and experience together to allow his clinical and educational presence to grow, to serve patients and physicians in the best way possible. He is a well-known continuing education presenter in the allopathic, naturopathic, acupuncture, and nursing CME arenas. His areas of specialty are in complex clinical medicine, intravenous and injection medicine, oncology, and genomics. Dr. Anderson is former chief of intravenous therapy services for Bastyr Oncology Research Center and a past professor at Bastyr University, where he continues to consult and research design and holds the rank of full professor. He is a graduate of the National University of Natural Medicine in Portland, Oregon, and began instructing classes in naturopathic medical schools in the early 1990s. Additionally, he is a medical author and speaks in many continuing medical education courses and events. He is extending his medical education mission through the Anderson Medical Group CE site, consultdra.com, a web-based educational platform. And getting to do this interview was certainly a full circle moment at its finest. We seem to be having a lot of those these days. But Dr. Anderson was our Sunrider's first naturopathic oncologist that was administering intravenous vitamin C and DMSO, along with answering a very long list of questions every time I saw him, which was pretty much from ground zero. We found him very early on and feel so blessed to have found him, as it turns out he may well be the smartest guy in the room when it comes to naturopathic oncology. We got into so much in this episode, starting with defining genetics, epigenetics, genomics, epigenomics, and nutrigenomics, all as they apply to cancer. We had a discussion on the primary driving force behind cancer and whether that is more of an epigenetic or metabolic nature, and whether there is such thing as a purely genetically inherited disease at all as opposed to a metabolic or epigenetic cancer. We got into everything you need to know about getting a report on your individual genetics and what to do with the results. We talked about methylation and histone expression as they apply to cancer, and Dr. Anderson's thoughts on childhood cancer and where it comes from in a context of epigenetic inheritance. And don't worry, there is a very actionable part of the interview after laying this foundation, which I promise will be so helpful in your research. And this consisted of the balance and timing between antioxidant therapies and pro-oxidant therapies, specifically how plant chemicals known as polyphenols can directly influence your epigenetic expression in various ways you'd want when it comes to cancer, and a ton of great tips on how to choose specific polyphenol supplements, as there are a lot of them, best practices in setting up a long-term rotation for yourself, and even specifically how to research what would be the dose of any given compound. That being said, I am glad you stopped by My Kid Cures Cancer, where it's our goal to bring all sides of the discussion on how to heal cancer and be truly healthy to the same table, to give you one place to tune into for the most well-rounded perspective possible. This is a show for people going through cancer, by people going through cancer, inspired by my wife Teddy and I's experience with childhood cancer, bringing our son Ryder from a stage 4 cancer diagnosis to the happy, healthy little boy he is today. If you aren't dealing with cancer and want to keep it that way, this show will likely be very helpful to you as well. We'll get to the interview with Dr. Anderson in just a couple minutes. A few things to go over before we do, starting with the most important piece of information you'll hear on this show today, and that is that the information you hear on this show is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Couple announcements. First and foremost, an acknowledgement of the awesomeness that is Susan Sullivan, both in her cool name and her actions. Susan has spoken with her dollars on our Patreon account that she is getting at least $2.50 worth of value per episode for a total of $10 per month at the fighter level. Susan, this means a whole lot to us and is what is going to carry us in our mission and what we're trying to do to help the kids and all people of the world going through cancer. If you would like to find out about how you can help, mykidcurescancer.com/crowd sponsor, and that's all one word, is the place for that. Also, if you're a fan of the YouTube channel from before this podcast began, you will be happy to know we're back to making videos. This podcast is sure a very large time commitment every week, to say the least, but we really missed making our little videos showing how we make all of this anti-cancer stuff work for our family, and I know a lot of you guys have too, given the requests we've been getting. So from here on out, you can expect at least one additional video per week on top of the podcast at the My Kid Cures Cancer YouTube channel, and you can actually go there right now to see what Ryder had for lunch yesterday for our first video back in action of this type, and let me tell you, it was delicious. I had it as well. There's plenty more of where that came from, so be sure to subscribe on the My Kid Cures Cancer YouTube channel if you haven't already and are into that sort of thing. And the best way to make sure you never miss anything we put out, for that matter, is to subscribe to the weekly newsletter where we talk about everything we put out for the week, along with any other anti-cancer tidbits that are on our mind, and you can do that right on the homepage at mykidcurescancer.com. And when you do, we will send you our short ebook, The 10 Things You Need to Know If Your Child Has Been Diagnosed with Cancer, and this is certainly something I wish I'd had early on in Ryder's diagnosis. So there's a couple reasons right there why it might be a good idea to subscribe. All right, with that, be sure you have your rewind finger ready, as this is a very high-level interview. Dr. Anderson is above all a teacher at heart, and I promise you, if you really commit to understanding everything that's laid out here, you will benefit so much in your research navigating through cancer. With that, let's get to the interview with Dr. Paul Anderson. Dr. Paul Anderson, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
And this is very neat. As you know, you were the first naturopathic oncologist we consulted in our journey through cancer, and I suppose I just want to thank you up front for being willing to work with children, because we've found out along the way that that's not always the case, and you seem to, well, either have no problem with it or at least do your part. So no, it was pretty neat getting to work with you. I'm rambling on, but thank you, Dr. Anderson.
Well, you're very welcome, and yeah, it's hard to find people who don't want to work with children, but I think they're just worried about liability and that sort of thing. And in my practice, the child is more important than liability, so that's just the way we go at it. But that's not for everybody.
yeah, no, and I can't even really fault the people that just don't, because there's a lot of people out there to help. So
True.
But little did I know that we were working with what seems to be the LeBron James of naturopathic oncology. I've gone to 2 naturopathic cancer conferences now, and who was giving the keynote at both of them, but Dr. Anderson. That was pretty neat. And just had no idea. We've consulted with several other naturopaths and naturopathic oncologists along the way, and I thought everyone would just have this, incredibly well thought out, scientifically based answer in a way that's easy for the patient to understand, to every single question I could ever throw at them. But you've proved to be the only one that's really that really fits that description. So I don't know how you do it, but you seem to know a lot, and you seem to know how to relate it to just about everybody. So I'm looking forward to the show.
Well, I'm aware that you know how to ask lots and lots of questions, so I can't wait for today. This should be fun. Yeah.
Well, that being said, So the conference that I first saw you at was the Oncology, excuse me, Association of Naturopathic Practitioners, and I guess I'll take back the being able to put it in an enjoyable way just a little bit, because I was looking around the room there, and even all these trained naturopathic oncologists were. I think you put it. You were looking out at the crowd, and a lot of them appeared in visible pain after your well, it was you and another lady. I forget her name, but it was very extensive. I'm sure you didn't miss any information.
Yeah, I should qualify it that as a speaker, there's assignments you get that sometimes you'd rather not have, but genomics in oncology is not an easy topic. There's a geneticist, PhD geneticist myself, who shared the presentation, and it's, I mean, even Santa Claus couldn't make that one fun, but but I did get good feedback later. I think when the shock wore off, they were a little better. But no, that was a tough one to make very amusing.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can do a better job of it today. At least talk about the fun stuff, I suppose.
Let's do that. Yeah.
That is what I have spent the last several hours basing the questions off of here. So.
Good.
And that being said, we were just talking before we started recording here, and we might as well. Actually, I'm sorry. Before that, would you like to give everyone just a hint of a background of what you've been up to for the past however many years in naturopathy and naturopathic oncology, and how you got into it, and did you ever heal yourself of some sort of crazy disease like it seems everyone else I've interviewed, or have you just always been interested in helping other people? I don't think I know that personally, so I'd be interested to hear.
Ever really, yeah, and I'm sure you have kind of a sanitized bio, which is that's my official story. But the shortest answer to how I got into all this, I had been, so this is my 41st year in medicine. The first, so obviously that started in the 70s. I was in laboratory medicine. And so one of the reasons I think the way that I do is I came from completely the opposite end of medicine, which is a very linear, very data-driven kind of a world. A lot of, math involved, a lot of other stuff involved. And I was doing very well at that. I had my own lab. I had all this stuff. And honestly, what turned the corner for us was we have 5 children, my wife and I. And they were all, well, only 4 were there at the time, but the older 2 were constantly getting sick, as most kids do. And finally, someone talked me into taking them to this naturopath they knew, and I thought, nature, what is that, et cetera. And the short story is they stopped getting sick all the time, and they became better, and I developed a relationship with this naturopathic doctor, and I had bad allergies, and he helped me, and I thought, I was kind of getting a little bored with laboratory medicine, and I decided, well, this seems like it'd be different every day. I'd probably like this, and so I literally, and thank heaven my wife stuck me through this. I sold our business and went back to school with 5 little babies.
Oh wow!
And still married after all these years. So it was actually the proof of something I had never assumed would work, which was natural medicine, and looking at it change the lives of my little children, who are all now adults. That's what kind of turned my head, and actually that when I started seeing children and adults mixed, and that's how I became so comfortable just with children. Some of my first oncology patients were children, and again, it was just I decided I didn't want to make a distinction there. So that's kind of how it happened, and then the trip to getting into oncology is a very long story, but it was basically based on need. People would come and they would say, and I'd say, well, I don't really do, I do a little oncology, but not a lot, because back then there was no onc-ANP or any of that stuff going on. I predate all that. So what happened was, and I do talks on this now, what we did 25 years ago, some of it we still do, but a lot of it we learned a ton from. So the stuff that like I was teaching and those other people were teaching at the onc-ANP, a lot of that comes from all the mistakes we made for a few decades, and we're learning more now. Like the stuff we're going to talk about today, we weren't even thinking about 10 years ago. So it's a long, strange trip to get to where I am, but that's the short version. Yeah.
Well, very good, very good. Now I know. Coming from some smart guy stuff, and you're applying the smart guy stuff to the natural stuff.
There you go.
All right. Well, let's jump into it, and again, I want to just kind of do our best, do your best, and I'll try to keep up. Just laying out genetics, epigenetics, genomics, epigenomics, which I didn't even think I knew epigenomics was a term until I started going back over the slides from the presentation. And then I also want to kind of contrast this with how it fits into the bigger picture, and especially how it compares to the metabolic theory. So I think maybe to start, there are the four terms I just mentioned. There's genomics, genetics, epigenomics, epigenetics. Could you just maybe a high level differentiate between those four, and then kind of just talk a little bit about how they are relevant in cancer, and then we can maybe go on from there.
Sure. So I'll start hopefully in some semblance of an order. So genetic just refers to anything to do with the genes in an organism. And so genetics is actually the study of genetic influences on normal things like replication of body cells, reproduction, all that sort of thing, and also how that can go wrong and potentially create a disease. Genomics, when omic at the end, so epigenomics or genomics really relates to, it relates more to the study and use of in medicine. So when you see genomics, what you're looking at there is it's all of genetics, and then you subdivide it into, for instance, pharmacogenomics. This is huge right now. So it's like if your genes go one way, a drug may be a poison to you. And if your genes go another way, the drug may be the best thing in the world for you. So that's pharmacogenomics. What we talk about, we'll probably talk a lot about today, pharmacogenomics comes into oncology a lot now, but what we'll probably talk about is the cousin of that, which is nutrigenomics. And that is, how do you use nutrients and nutrition to both maybe manipulate the genome that's weak in an area, but also maybe stop it from going bad. So the genomic thing. Now, epi means around. So epigenetics and epigenomics are basically, we'll kind of lump them together. And a geneticist sometimes take issue with this, but to make it simple, I'm just going to make a very broad statement. So if you're a geneticist listening, I apologize. I know what I'm saying when it goes off the reservation here. But epigenetics are sort of a way to say your genes are one thing, but how your environment and everything that affects you throughout your entire life, and even how it affected your parents and your grandparents sometimes, will change the way those genes express. So you can have really bad genes in your genome, and if you have not had them epigenetically turned on, so to speak, they don't do anything. They're quiet. So epigenetics and epigenomics that's actually the more, here's the conundrum. That's where the rubber meets the road with cancer and any other disease. but it's very difficult to study, and you can't really test it because it's everything that happened to you your whole life, and then what happened to your mom, and all that. So that's the real mind-bending part of genetics. The genetic part, yes, there's lots and lots of data to look at. The genetic part is actually a little easier. It's how what happened to you and your parents changes that, which is the epi part.
So yeah, I've always understood that about epigenetics, that they can be, either expressed or not expressed, and that's kind of the change that you're looking at. But, and I'm sorry if you already explained it, but how does the epi part apply to epigenomics? Are we talking about actually changing the genes themselves, or the pairings, or something like that, or am I thinking about it the wrong way?
Yeah, I think the concept of epigenomics instead of epigenetic is sort of like a thing that happens. Epigenomics is actually the study and the potential clinical use of, okay, what's gone wrong before? Have you had toxic exposures? Have you had this or that happen that might turn the genes on? And then is there a way that we could do something to quiet that down? So if something gets turned on, theoretically it could be turned off. Now that's not always possible. And as I was saying, this is the harder part of genetics to study and understand. But that's really what's exciting to me is, although we don't know most of it and we know a little bit of it, that's the place where things like lifestyle and natural medicine, nutrition, Nutrigenomics, stuff like that, that's where that can actually affect someone in a disease state.
Okay, so it's kind of, what do you do with it?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
And there's certainly things you can't do right now anything with. So, there's that too. Yeah.
All right. So, and I guess we'll dive into each of those terms a little deeper as we go forward here. But I mean, first off, we just released Professor Seyfried, Thomas Seyfried's interview, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease, in which, he spent a long time talking about the nuclear transfer experiments and how you can put a healthy nucleus inside a cancerous cytoplasm with bad mitochondria, and then the nucleus will turn cancerous, but then vice versa. So he's, really making the case that any sort of, at least in cancer, that any sort of genetic or epigenetic phenomenon is really a downstream event, that these things only get turned on as a result of damaged respiration. I also just interviewed Travis Christofferson. He's talking about the massive failure, or at least as he put it, I haven't looked into it myself much, of the Cancer Atlas Genome Project, and how there was supposed to be all these, miraculous cures that came out of mapping, the genome of cancer, and not a whole lot to show for it. So yeah, that being said, before we go any further, how do we take that in light of all the genetic and epigenetic stuff that we know about as it pertains to cancer? And, I guess, why is it not a waste of time for you and I to spend the next hour or so talking about epigenetics as it applies to cancer?
That is the best way to look at it. And I don't know if any of the people you've interviewed, just while we're talking about failures, there also is a technology called, it's an acronym, CRISPR, and it actually attempts to do some gene manipulation to try and undo disease. Great idea. Very early idea. What we see with that is, in some cases, when you undo one part where you see a broken piece, you create other disorders downstream. So I think that just to put it in perspective, genomics is, here to stay, because again, we know a very little bit about a very big subject. Epigenetics, etc., to me, and I would totally agree with Dr. Seyfried, most of the epigenetic triggers or switches that turn the disease states on, or turn the weak genes on, whatever way you want to talk about it, are triggered because of upstream problems that occur, and usually they do start with some mitochondrial damage. So they're really not mutually exclusive. It's just so one of the things I think that was referenced when we did our talk. So there's myself as a clinician, and then there's a PhD geneticist, very brilliant woman who thankfully did all the really hard slides, right? Well, her lead-off slide was, cancer is a disease of the genome, which is kind of what's been in the books for a long time. And what we see is it depends what part you're looking at. If you're looking at the genome, yeah, sure. But I think what Dr. Seyfried and just so, I guess it's out there, and, I study and practice metabolic therapies for cancer and chronic illness more than I do anything else. So the way that I look at it is, yes, probably most things start in the metabolome, which usually starts in the mitochondria, works its way out. Then whatever that problem was, if it turns on the weak genes, as if I understand where the weak genes are and what I can do in a gentle way with their nutrition, with their whatever, get the toxins away, etc., I can work on the metabolic part, but I can use the genetic part or the epigenetic part, whichever way you want to look at it, as a support for the metabolic therapy. So they don't have to have, two problems going that you're only fixing one. Because the problem is, once you get disease, and this actually, speaking of childhood cancers, many of the ones that we see, the child usually was born with the beginnings of it, or maybe even an advanced stage of a disease. So the metabolic and epigenetic changes that went on, they're not, they kind of came with the person, as opposed to an adult where maybe they were toxic for 20 years and then it happened, right?
Yeah.
So the thing that I see is, and really this is not, what I always tell audiences is, of doctors, is there's the first 20 pages of your pathology book, which is usually a 3-inch thick book. Nobody reads the first 20 pages, okay? And that's not true, but many people don't. And in the first 20 pages, they usually tell you that all disease starts in the mitochondria and works its way out, and then eventually becomes a pathology. So that's very old information. Nobody wants to think about it because they don't know what to do with mitochondria. So I guess the way I look at it is, the more pieces of the puzzle I can affect and rebalance, the better. And I think that one of the things that we see, like you read these articles, or you actually interviewed one of the authors, about the grand failures of genetics and genomics in oncology. Here's the other side of it, and I don't know if you were able to stay conscious through that whole thing that we did there that day on Anki about genetics, but one of the reasons why there's so many failures is they're trying to use a silver bullet technology with genomics, which don't react well to silver bullets. Like, you can't put one thing in and change, something that's got 3 million parts. It just doesn't work, right? So I look at genomics and epigenomics and all that as another tool to help heal something. And yes, you're coming in a bit downstream, but downstream's already messed up, so you got to kind of fix both.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad to hear you say that. And one, I did know that your main thing, I guess you could call it, was metabolics. But after Seyfried, Christofferson, and Winters, Naisha Winters as well, just did a really good interview with her. Kind of beating the metabolic thing to death for a little while, and figured
Let's talk about genomics, shall we?
Yeah.
I'm good.
But I almost kind of look at it as, you almost like working backwards in a sense. Like you still, you have to work on the metabolic stuff, but like you said, when the genetic stuff is messed up as well, turning off oncogenes and turning on tumor suppressor genes, that still sounds like a good idea if you have cancer.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very true.
All right. So, and I'm not even sure if I'd kind of lumped these categories together, but what the heck? We'll say we're talking about genomics. We'll start with genomics right now. Um, so I was looking at a study you had posted on the slides, and it was basically the gist of it was clinical cancer care now includes epigenomics related to inherited forms of cancer, as well as epigenomic testing, preventative care, and treatment responses. So I guess my question there is, given what we know about epigenetics and, genes being expressed and, the more and more people are talking about how, cancer is by and large not a problem of the genes like we just kind of talked about. But genes can be expressed differently and they can be turned on, turned off. Is there still a portion of cancer in your mind that is purely genetic as opposed to, arising from a mitochondrial problem or some sort of, epigenetic genes expressing in a bad way? Is there such thing as a purely genetic inherited cancer? And if so, what percentage of cancer are we talking about? In Dr. Anderson's mind, of course.
Well, thanks for a really easy question. Yeah, I think, and this is the way I approach everything. Uh, Other than things like gunshot wounds and broken legs and stuff like that, there are very few things in medicine that are singularities. And when you get away from acute problems like getting stabbed or shot or something, which is pretty much one problem, and you get to things like cancer, there are examples of sleeper genes, and this is more, well, my experience, much more common in childhood cancers. Some of the leukemias where you literally have a gene, a particular gene defect that is silent. And what happens is often the child expresses one type of leukemia early in life. And it's one of these, it's a very difficult thing to watch, because what happens is it looks like they have a very curable form of leukemia. Everything shows that. And the treatment usually turns the sleeper gene on, and then they have a very untreatable type of leukemia. Now, in that case, and the treatment I'm talking about is a particular group of chemotherapies, but in that case, the epigenetic trigger is actually the chemotherapy. And so it takes a lower grade, there's no good leukemia, but it takes a lower grade leukemia and turns it into a real monster. So you can point to certain examples of cancers that children may be born with, et cetera. And you can say, well, if there was something outside of a genetic cause, it was pretty early in their fetal life, or there was a trigger that was actually, parental or grandparental or something like that. I think that the amount of things that would be mostly genetic as far as cancer goes are in the minority, though. I think the majority of cancer, so I gave you a real rare but true example of childhood thing. I think the majority are a collusion of mitochondrial dysfunction, metabolic dysfunction, and then those are like, they're the perfect epigenetic negative effect on then something downstream that triggers a proto-oncogene and an oncogene, all that stuff.
What is the group of chemos that that have the bad epigenetic effect on the particular leukemia? And is there some sort of classification, or I don't know all the staging and differentiations between all the different leukemias, but I'd be interested to get the details on that.
Well, it's a pretty long story, so I'll make it really short.
If the name jumps out to whoever is actually going through that particular thing.
So I'll start with the problem in the works, really, which one of them is called a MLL gene expression, and it's a mixed lymphocytic leukemia gene it's a sleeper gene usually. So a child might be born and they may express an acute lymphocytic leukemia type, a ALL type, which has a reasonably good treatment rate, really, with standard chemotherapy, etc. In the rare instance where a child is MLL gene positive, then usually, and it's not, the group of chemos are really, they tend to be either oxidative type chemotherapies or nuclear substitution type chemotherapies. And it's really just any stressor like the treatment of the cancer that then turns that gene on. So thankfully it's a very rare occurrence, but it's one of those things that does happen in children. And normally it's so rare that they get gene typed and they see, oh, they've got that, and then they go on and they look at other genomic typing and all that. And while we're on that topic, and just if you want another example of right now usually failures in genomic therapy, most of the genomic tag therapies that they're using in, say, leukemias have very short-term benefit. And then, because the genome is so complicated, again, you go in and you fix one place where there's a really bad gene, it finds other ways to express. And to have maybe a little sunnier point of view on that, if you have that situation where you then turn into a mixed leukemia, which is very difficult to survive, one of the things that we found out a number of years ago was that the only thing that would keep the child alive would be a metabolic therapy. So it kind of came full circle where you've got this genetic problem. It's hardcore. It's easy to see once you know it's there. You know how it got turned on, but getting it shut down, the things that worked really were metabolic therapy. So again, knowing the genes is important because you're dealing with an apple and not an orange, but that's probably not where the cure is going to come from. Yeah.
Well, that's good to hear. And you know what? I just want to take us on a huge tangent for 1 minute because I want to get the chance to ask you this, and I haven't really. What are the in your mind the primary insults to the mitochondria that cause the damage, the respiration in the first place? Is it? It seems like maybe it's all the same stuff you hear about anyway in terms of disease with toxicity and inflammation and blah blah blah. But I'd just love to hear your thoughts on what initially goes wrong with the mitochondria now that we've structured this whole podcast to be about the genes.
Right. So in my experience, in the minority of cases, there are actually genetic problems in the way mitochondria, replicate and are built. Usually, the real bad ones are when they're a baby or a little bit older, they start to get very bizarre sorts of symptoms and stuff like that in true mitochondrial disease. But what I normally tell patients, especially the adult patients, is because let's just say for the sake of even numbers, I've looked at about 2,500 genomic assessments of that many patients, and they weren't all my patients. I do it to help other doctors, stuff like that. But it's a lot, okay? Plenty. And each one of them of the type that we were doing had mitochondrial gene arrays and all of that stuff. The majority of people who had mitochondrial dysfunction had pretty clean genes. The genes really were not the problem. So then that leads to, well, if it's not the genes usually, why would mitochondria go bad? Well, it is the things that you could guess. And deep in all those slides, I think towards the end I tried to make it somewhat clinically relevant and go through, okay, what are epigenetics is the history of you for sure, and probably some of your ancestors. And the things that you're curious about in the history are, because not just because they turn genes on, but because they're mitochondrial toxins, are toxic exposures that are known mitochondrial poisons, lots of chemicals, cadmium, mercury, all the bad guys like that. But there's a lot of chemicals that we're exposed to all the time, just in the air and in the stuff that holds our water and all kinds of stuff that are also mitochondrial poisons. So we're sort of, tacitly exposed to mitochondrial poisons all the time. And then if you take a little extra radiation on top, nutrient deficiencies are huge here. Redox, which I think is something we ought to talk about today, keeping the balance between oxidation and reduction. You chip away a little bit at like 12 things, and you can have the best mitochondrial genes in the world, and your mitochondria will just not work very well. And you see this same pattern in cancer and chronic illness, just expresses different.
There you go. Yeah, it's it kind of reminds me of my first interview with Chris Wark when I started asking him about this stuff, and he had very good answers for everything, but he just kind of stepped back and said, at the end of the day, you just really need to focus on getting yourself well. And,
right.
Flooding yourself with nutrition and detox, and this stuff's going to sort itself out, and you don't really need to know what the heck's going on in there.
It's interesting as having a conversation with I'll just say a famous genomics figure in the world last night, and I don't have their permission to share their name, so I won't, but most people listening probably would know who it is. And we were just sitting talking back and forth about teaching doctors about all this and everything, and we started talking about metabolomics and the crossover between genetics and metabolism. And we both laughed and said, the biggest problem is if someone asks us, well, how do you effectively test the metabolomic part, or how do you effectively test which part of the mitochondria is not working? You really, outside of a research lab, that's not something you can go to your doctor and get anyway. And so at the end of the day, certainly if there's obvious things, like you have high cadmium or you're exposed to whatever, get that out, get away from it, clean up your life, clean up your environment best you can. There's no perfect world. And then a lot of the things that repair the mitochondria are actually, when your mitochondria aren't working, they're the hardest things to do, such as starting to exercise again, because that actually forces your muscle and your liver mitochondria, your heart mitochondria to recharge, and then that sends signals to the others to recharge, but you don't feel like it. So it's like that's a super hard thing. A lot of it's just doing the work of trying to get better, and then this is really, though, just so we don't bash genomics too much. It's true. The way we do it right now, it's a failure for cancer therapy, but that's more about the way we think about cancer in North America than anything. But when it comes to getting better and trying to undo all this junk that happens, if I have a patient and they're trying to detox and they're doing all this stuff, but I know that they have epigenetically probably turned on weak SNP areas in their genome, so their detox pathways are really slow. If I don't support those, they're gonna get sicker. So it does help to know both things.
And that was actually my last genomic question before we moved into genetics and epigenetics was, could you define an SNP or a SNP, and let us know how that relates to cancer? Sure.
So a SNP is a single nucleotide polymorphism, and everyone's seen the pictures of the double helix and where the base pairs come together. And basically, what happens is where two opposing base pairs are supposed to stick together, And then when they unwrap, they do different things like code for mitochondrial DNA or code for replication RNA or whatever they're going to do. If you have a pair that's a slight mismatch, there's different ways to do it. It's called a polymorphism, so single nucleotide polymorphism. So it's just like, my two fingers. So if I have a heterozygous one, instead of my two index fingers, I got my pinky and my index finger, it's going to act different. If I have a homozygous SNP, instead of two index fingers, it's sort of like I have, a pinky and a middle finger coming together, and it's like that's just not going to do the right thing downstream. The thing that happens is, and there's literally millions of potentials, so you've got a lot of base pairs. The problem is what that SNP would do if it's active. So this is the place where, let's say it's totally messed up, and I got a middle finger and a pinky coming together, and it's supposed to be two index fingers. If my epigenetics have been very clean, there's been no stressors in that area, that may not express because your body has a lot of backup genes, okay? But if I've had a lot of stressors in the area, and what I tell doctors, if the patient's chronically ill or they have cancer, they've had enough stress to probably turn many of the bad genes on. So you can assume that. So if that thing is supposed to code for something like detoxification, and I've got a bunch of them in one area of detoxification, guess what happens? As the toxins come in, I can't get them out efficiently, and every year I'm alive, I get more toxins exposed, and I'm always backed up. Well, those toxins then go and they turn on the bad mitochondrial function, and then that can trigger, any number of things, potentially cancer being one of them. And toxins are just they're an easy target for this discussion because everyone kind of knows what toxins are and what they do and how they poison us. But many other things can do it too. Chronic poor nutrition can turn these things on. But then here's the next step, and this is why I think it's very tough for it's tough for clinicians, and actually I think the only way it will become not tough is computer modeling, because there's too much to remember. And that is, you have to survey the SNP areas, assume if they're sick, maybe that they're turned on epigenetically. But then the next thing is you have to understand what the function is of that area. So if you don't know that function leads to bad detox, or you don't know that function leads to weird methylation, you don't realize that's just one more trigger to back up, to either hit the mitochondria or start to make changes in cells that aren't going to end well. So it's really it's about identifying where those mismatches are, looking at the history and the symptoms to see, do they look turned on, and then knowing what would they do if they are turned on, like how bad can that be? And sometimes it's nothing, sometimes it's pretty bad.
And if how are we identifying the SNPs? I'm not really familiar with just genetic testing in general and when you would want to do that. And I think I had that actually scheduled for a little later in the conversation, but what the heck?
Seems like a good.
Yeah, it seems like a good time. So, like, how do you go about testing your genetics or your genomics and finding these SNPs and other things like that? Is that something I can just walk into my general practitioner and ask for? Do I have to, have cancer and get a referral from my oncologist for that sort of thing? What all is involved there?
So this, I'll just preface what I'm about to say with, this is an area of intense debate and unhappiness among many, many different types of doctors right now. So what I will do is I will tell you the truth about what exists, and then I'll explain why people are upset about that. So here's the thing. Up until a very few years ago, the only time genomics or genetics would be investigated or considered would either be if you went in and you tell your doctor, my wife and I are considering having a baby, but we have hemophilia in the family, or we have this or that in the family. They send you to geneticists. They do an assessment, usually of your family pedigree and lineage, and say you've got this much chance of having this happen. And then the next step came, which was a really good step because it's helped a lot of babies born with deep mitochondrial illness. So there's a difference between mitochondrial dysfunction and being inborn mitochondrial illness, which is metabolic diseases of the infant, and children die of that. So what they did is they then developed technology to check the SNPs associated with those metabolic diseases in babies and other problems. So then those SNP tests were done, and then they looked at other, like there's seizure disorders and metabolic other stuff. So really up until very recently, all genetic testing and genomics and all that was in the realm of the geneticist at the hospital, who is the best trained in that type of genetics and genetic heritable diseases, et cetera. So that really is all that's existed until very recently. What has caused a lot of problem, and I can see both sides because I look at and assess both sides, is there are now direct-to-consumer tests that people can do where they can go and get their genome sequence, the SNP sequence, and they can send it to, because that's a lot, it's this giant data file that is absolutely meaningless. It's meaningful, but only to a computer. So then they send it to a reporting service that will turn it into some kind of report. Now, that's great because it suddenly took us from this little tiny amount of genetic information and all that was, in the hands of a very hyper-specialized group of physicians. And then it's sort of like it took it and blew it up, and everyone can know everything about their genome, but not understand it. So the problem is right now, and you see that, the geneticists from, the hospital geneticists are, put out warnings to people and say, don't, if you do these tests, you don't know what they mean, and all this stuff. It's very, they really don't like that. The truth of it is, though, what I'll tell people is it doesn't matter even if you as a physician don't want these things to happen. Any patient can go out and get any one of these tests run, and then they'll come into you with somewhere between a 10 and a 100-page report and say, what does this mean? And it's all these SNPs, and that really blows people out of the water. So what I will tell you is, if you go to most, say, your primary care doctor or your oncologist, they're going to say, well, if there's a genetic component to what's going on with you, I'm going to send you to the hospital geneticist. They're going to go through it with you. Great. And there's a super big role for that. Like there's a reason that exists. If you are looking at most of what we're talking about, or probably will be talking about, which is Nutrigenomics. So when you're looking at what do I eat or not eat, what nutrients am I low, what I need more of, that's not like genetic counseling and disease oriented. That's just prevention oriented, really. Those SNP reports that people get, they're definitely not perfect. There's no perfect test, but especially when you got all these, millions of genes you're looking at, you do have to take that into consideration. But in the hands of somebody who knows how to assess that sort of report, they can look and they can say, okay, you have cancer. We already know that. What can we do to maximize the treatment, especially the natural types of treatment, like how we focus your diet, how we focus your supplements and things that you may want to take or not take, so that we're supporting the weakest areas genetically, so we do the best job for you. Those type of genomic reports that, like I say, are mostly consumer driven, in the hands of somebody who knows what to do with the information, can be very, very useful. Now, here's the rub. Until very recently, most of those, all you could get, you get your genome sequenced, or your SNP sequence, you get this report, and it tells you, I've got this type of, MTHFR defect, and I have this type of this other defect, and all this stuff. If your doctor doesn't know what all that means, because they probably only heard it once a long time ago in biochemistry, they're still not going to know what to do with the information. So what's happening now is there are physicians who are going and using computer modeling technology to take the report and then say, these are the important areas to look at, doctor, and here's what this means. And I've taught doctors this for a long time, and what I've come to is it's really hard to do without some kind of computer modeling. I taught biochemistry and pharmacology for many years, and biochemistry is really driven by SNPs. So if you know biochemistry really well, you can kind of sight read these reports and know what to do. What I'm finding is that's a very rare sort of a skill that people have. So these computer models are probably the best way to figure out what to make of all that.
Kind of sounds like the when the Bible was first translated into English.
Mm. Yeah, something like that. I think. Yeah, and I, you have to. I mean, people will come in and they'll be upset with their primary care doctor. So I mean, you got to give everyone a break here, because there has never in medicine really been as short of a time period where something so complicated became available to everyone in the world. And I tell people, imagine if you only had like 3 lab tests you could do, and then suddenly you had these big panels we do now with 100 different analytes on it, and you had to know tomorrow what that meant. No one's going to know. I mean, this things evolve, and this is like taking that times 1,000. I mean, it's really that complicated. So there are very good people working on computer modeling, making it make sense. They're very good, educated people trying to do this. But it's people do need to know if they go kind of to their conservative medical provider, the only genetic stuff is going to be the geneticist. Geneticists will tell you all this other stuff should not be done by anybody, for any reason. So, no, I've had patients get yelled at by geneticists. So you kind of have to know that going in.
So I guess on that note, are there any particular services or resources that stand out in your mind right now as folks doing a good job of being able to break this stuff down for people?
Yeah, there are 2, and I'm sure there are more, but and I have no connection financially to anything I'm talking about. I just don't. But there are 2 reporting services that will take the same data, and what they do is they come up with, you get the report, but you get commentary that says, this is a big deal, this is a small deal, don't worry about it, or this is medium, and if there's a lot of it, here's what you do. And one is called Opus 23, sort of a play on the gene, and that's available. And what they do is that actually both of these, it's the same deal. Providers will be kind of trained, and so if there's a provider that does this, they've at least looked into training. Opus 23 is one, and then another one called Strategene, and I think it's just STRATEGENE or something very close to that. And they're very similar, developed by people who have been doing this thing about it, just as a way to break it down for the practitioner and the patient to say, here's how to prioritize what to do.
And then I guess I might as well just back it up one step further. I know as far as the testing in general, 23andMe has clearly done the best job of marketing. It's what comes to mind. What do you think about that, or is there a reason to get to get this test done one place or another? Or is there anyone else that comes to mind for you?
So what something like 23andMe does is really turn your cheek cells into raw data, and so they break down, and the raw data then is taken by one of these other reporting services and turned into something you can read. The thing people need to know with something like 23andMe is it's consumer driven, so it's not under the legal protections that your regular medical labs are. So now, while there's no reason that anyone would think they would do it, there's no real privacy protections that can be enforced. Like if you go to your lab down the street that's at the hospital, they have really tight privacy, and all that stuff. So aside from that, that's where most people actually get their raw data done is through 23andMe, and then they send that data file to one of these reporting services. There have been, I know in my own, so multiply this by a number of people, my own personal history, there have been 5 different genomics companies who have approached me and said, we want to build a genomics platform that'll be protected as a lab and all this stuff. And they get into it, they find out how complicated and how costly it is, and most of the lab companies just give up. So right now, you sort of have the consumer-driven 23andMe approach, and you got a couple labs that do specialty stuff. But most of the specialty lab genomic stuff is really for drug therapies, and so it doesn't really help you with nutrition anyway.
All right. That's good enough. Let's back it up just a little bit, and maybe let's dive into epigenetics a little more thoroughly. Could you give us a little deeper explanation of what epigenetics are? What are their and then maybe what are some examples of like a normal cellular epigenetic process to kind of paint a better picture of what we're talking about that isn't necessarily related to cancer?
Yeah, I think and again being kind of broad in description here, epigenetic or paragenetics, something that is outside of the gene that affects the gene. That's kind of the best way to say it. Those effects, and we could get more esoteric and talk about multi-generational epigenetics. Let's just keep it to who we are and our genes. Otherwise, we'd way too long. The best way that I can say it is you have the potential, if you don't have, say, a genetic defect that causes a well-known disease that is 100%, sickle cell disease or, Pompei's disease or Hurler's or some of these, genomic diseases. Let's say you don't have that. We're all born with genetic SNPs that have brothers and sisters that are all the same, they code for the same thing. So you might have a real people and have been really into methylation, so I'll use that as an example. You might have a gene problem in part of your methyl cycle, but there will be a couple of other backup genes or maybe a number of backup genes for the same part of the process. So if you have a bad SNP in one, but the others are normal, and you don't have a lot of epigenetic stressors on the area, you may have totally normal function there. So you'll methylate appropriately, even though you have the SNP that's not supposed to operate correctly. On the other hand, if you take and you put a stressor into the system, such as, say, a metal or a chemical toxin, here's one that people sometimes will miss: long-term physical or mental emotional stress. Does same thing, big epigenetic stressor because of the hormone and the cytokine changes. Chronic infections. To circle back to cancer, almost every type of chronic infection now has data showing that it can trigger cancerous processes, and sometimes the link is actually an epigenetic link because of what the infection does in the body to the immune system. So the epigenetic idea is, if my genes are all lined up perfect in an area, I can beat them up as much as I want epigenetically, and they're still going to code exactly the same for the right thing. If I have an area and I've got some mismatches, and I beat it up epigenetically, I'm going to start to express whatever that problem is. Slow methylation, slow detoxification, maybe poor mitochondrial function, maybe an inability to use a certain B vitamin appropriately. So really, I conceptualize an epi or paragenetic stress as something that beats on the genome, the weak areas kind of crumble, and then they start to become dysfunctional.
Could we dive into or better explain what methylation is in the first place, and maybe histone expression as well?
So the methylation is fairly simple, and that's adding a methyl group onto something. The one that's famous is MTHFR gene, which is part of a big cycle called the methyl cycle. And its goal is to take folate and put a methyl group on it so that it becomes methylfolate. And then what happens there, and this relates to your normal cell replication, but can also relate to cancer. The methylfolate then, think of it like an active folate, that goes directly to where you make your nucleotides. And there's a purine family and a pyrimidine family of nucleotides, but really what those guys are going to do is they're going to be primers for cell replication. And the methylation process, when it slows down, nucleotide production slows down and gets abnormal. And then that can create dysfunction or disease depending on where the cell is. So this is all our cells do this, right? Because they all have to, we regenerate our cells constantly. So what we see is if someone has an upstream problem like the methylation is slow, then the nucleotides that help you make baby cells slows down. You got a rapidly dividing tissue like your bone marrow and your immune cells. You can get just imbalances in the way your immune system functions. So that's kind of like that methylation piece. It's the upstream part that turns on getting baby cells made, essentially. When you look at histones, and there's all sorts of other mechanical parts to just doing some quick self-editing to make this not go really long here. When you think about any process in the body where you're either going to repair a cell or make daughter cells, new baby cells that are going to be normal and new and all that stuff, there's places where either the different types of the RNA or the DNA opening or the copying process can go wrong. Not kind of go wrong. They can go wrong. There are spots where the histones interact with this. There are promoter regions and suppressor regions and all these other different places. Now, the crossover in cancer is that a histone can be methylated, just like I was talking about nucleotides can be methylated. And if it's in a cancerous cell, the concern is that will actually trigger the explosive growth of that cancerous cell. So, and I think one of the things that kind of came up in that presentation you listened to is that's the methylation thing that gets everybody's attention is, oh, well, then methylation's probably bad because, it's going to turn on replication. Well, number one, if you shut off methylation, we would just all die because, our normal cells methylate. But here's the part that it's sort of forest and the trees thing. There's this, kind of core part here where the histones are having all this trouble, and they get methylated, and they're already going, they're triggering bad processes genetically. But methylation in the big picture actually stops cancerous processes from turning on at about 1,000 to 1. So 1,000 stopping cancer cells to 1 promoting. Now that doesn't mean that you want to have like if a little methylation is good, a ton is great. No, yeah, it has to be balanced and all that stuff, right? Um, but we do miss that because, and here's the reason I think that we miss it. A, a lot of drug development went into looking at blocking the methyl tag on histones and other places like that. So, okay, we'll stop it. Now, here again, this is one of these places where if genomics was going to give us a silver bullet, that should have done it. These types of drugs work sometimes, but most of the time either stop working totally or create so much dysfunction in the normal tissue that the person gets sick or dies of side effects from the drug. So it's sort of this, yeah, we stop methylation in that one place, but then the person's immune system quit working. Kind of a bad trade-off, you know. And what I've seen these drugs work occasionally, but I will just tell patients, just be aware of that. If you have these anti-methylation type drugs, look at the side effects very carefully. You'll see a lot of them are immune suppression, etc. It goes back to that thing of if I have 1,000 good methylation things that are anti-cancer and I've got one bad one, the 1,000 that are good, some of them are going to be blocked, and some of these things that, like, I need my bone marrow, if that goes away, I have problems. So it's not, the drug's bad or it's good or whatever. It's an example of a targeted drug that should just stop cancer in its tracks, and it usually doesn't. And then the person gets these bad side effects. So, and that relates more to the histone methylation than the other one. But yeah, so I think that, I think this fits in here. I don't think I'm segueing too far out. This is something that people miss, and I think it's why this discussion goes on about methylation. Is it good or bad? They want one answer in cancer, and there's not one answer for almost anything in cancer, as you know. Methylation has to be balanced. There are definitely times in rare instances where you do not want to expose active cancerous cells to methyl donors because they'll suck them up and use them and all that stuff. But for the most part, when you're talking about prevention and most cancers, methylation is not just that adding methyl group to folate or doing, methylating a histone or something. It's a whole family. If the family is balanced and you're not overdoing any of it, you get a much higher propensity for that protective effect. If you just slam a whole bunch of methyl donors in, which I've seen people do, and so they take methyl B12 and methylfolate in real high doses and nothing else, you're imbalancing the system. And then you have, we used to tell my students, it's sort of like when I was a kid, I was very curious, and if I didn't have things to do, I would find things to do, and they were never good. Curiosity and little kid with time on his hands, stuff burned and blew up and all sorts of stuff. Well, that's what extra methyl donors do. They're just roaming around the body, and they will find something to do evil with. So these things have to be balanced. And really most controversies in medicine come back to the Western approach is not a very well balanced approach. It's all about if X is good, let's just do a lot of X. And you can't do that, especially with these things in cancer.
Well, yeah, you managed to touch on a good chunk of the next 10 or 20 questions I had for you. So we can just
good.
Skip past a lot of that stuff. Right. You covered it all, Dr. A. Actually, to drag it out just a little further, though, you said you didn't want to go into it because it would take too long. But if you could sum it up in a minute or two, I would be interested to hear if you have any thoughts on upstream epigenetics in terms of what happened with your parents and your grandparents. And I mean, I think people kind of get the concept that your parents' epigenetics can change, and then that'll get passed on to you, and it's not really your genetics, but it is how they express.
Right.
Does that Does that play into childhood cancer in your mind?
You know, that's I'm happy to talk about that. Actually, it's a rabbit hole that can get really deep.
And I do want to save some time to get into the fun nutrigenomics and all that. So yeah.
One thing I will say, and you can get it probably free on YouTube or somewhere. The Discovery Channel about 5 years ago did this awesome special on epigenetics, mostly from the point of view of intergenerational. So what happened to grandma and grandpa and how that affects me. And so if you want to get a start on the rabbit hole, it's very well done. Look, Discovery Channel, epigenetics, way better description than I'm about to do. But the other thing, and I just want to say it because now we're going to talk about, mom, dad, grandpa, and grandma and all that sort of stuff. People will often say, well, so these SNPs come from your parents, and obviously they've been around for as long as people have. Why don't my parents or my grandparents, why didn't they express these problems? And that's a really huge thing. Another thing that nobody seems to want to talk about, except people like you, is why was the incidence of cancer, and especially childhood cancer, so low? So my parents are around 90. My grandparents obviously would be 100 and some. In their generations, this is just not something you saw, right? Especially childhood cancer, and the amount of cancer was way less. It's the same answer. So let's say I got a methylation, genomic problem, and I got it from mom and dad. Well, why didn't they express it? Two things. Epigenetically, very few triggers, lower toxin levels, etc. But here's the other thing. Most things that get turned on epigenetically take toxins out of this, or lower toxins, like by 10,000%, 50 years ago, 80 years ago. The other thing is the food that my parents ate, from 70, 80, 90 years ago was better nutritionally than the best organic food you can buy today. Number one, the environment was better, but number two, the nutrients were there. They ate real food. They didn't have anything that was adulterated because it wasn't available. And so when and this has actually been borne out in studies, you look at taking vegetables, which grandma told you to eat, and and in those vegetables, even when you cook them, there's methylated forms of folate. There's all this stuff that you need, right? Plus polyphenols and all these other things. So they were bathing in good stuff. They didn't know it. They were just eating the food that was available. You take a few generations down, and we're not only toxic, but we hardly can get, good food. So our genes get turned on epigenetically much quicker. Now, just then to take that out a step and say, how is it that what happened to grandma and grandpa or my grandma or whatever, how does that turn on problems downstream? Again, something you can look up. There's a lot of really good presentations on YouTube on this. Easiest one, I think, to understand, and we'll get to cancer in a second, but this is related, is diabetes and what they call the thrifty genes, another sleeper gene. So if especially parents, but especially grandparents, experienced famine and stressors like that, and these thrifty genes are in there, grandma and grandpa and mom and dad maybe even would express no diabetic tendencies. Child or grandchild, you might see their entire generation, 60, 70% of them will express diabetic tendencies, and they all had the same genes. Well, the thing that happens upstream is something like the thrifty gene gets turned on, and then, so I'll just give a really personal example, but it kind of makes the point. My father has these same genes inherited. He, of course, grew up in this healthy time, all this stuff. They were never epigenetically turned on. He can eat pretty much anything. His blood sugar is always stable. Everything's cool. He's never gained weight, all those things. So just this like golden experience. Why he's 90, right? My brother and I, it not so. Can't eat, have to be very, very careful with diet and all this stuff. And our blood sugar is very touchy and all this. Why? It actually started 2 generations ago with my grandparents and famine and things like that. They get turned on. Parents' generation, they're still asleep because they actually had reasonable nutrition, all that stuff. My generation, it's over. They're on and they're ready, so my body's waiting for famine to happen, and we just don't get that anymore. So I have to create famine, or I get really large. So that's how that works that way. Now, the reason I chose those, so diabetes is an easy one to study. It's easy to look at in famine and thrifty gene and all that. It's great to, that's a good first one to dive into. But here's the thing. The same thrifty genes and diabetic tendencies, all that stuff, to bring it full circle, those are the things that then start the metabolic disorders that you see that fuel sleeping cancer cells. So when you talk to Dr. Seyfried, you're talking about a glycolytic pathway versus an OXPHOS pathway and all that stuff. When you have these things that you're just like, you tell students it's like when you have them, you have super insulin. It's like your insulin is just, it's doing the stuff it's supposed to do and the stuff it's not supposed to do at the same time. Well, if you're that kind of person, and then you've got say nascent cancer cells, babies that are just sitting there, stem cells or something, and you're bombarding them with good fuel sources because that's what the rest of your body is doing, you're more likely to turn on a lot of types of cancers, and the metabolic type of cancer fire in someone like myself, it's a bonfire because we already have the metabolic problem that creates blood sugar issues, all that stuff. And then you go over the other side and you've got this metabolic trigger for cancer. It's like, boom, it's out of the box. What I surmise from my experience, but I don't know how many people have actually done enough research to say it's exactly this or not. Childhood cancers, because as we talked about, I work with them. That is a question that I have always had, is when I see a little child that's diagnosed at 10 weeks old, or a brain tumor at 9 years old, or whatever, we know all the stories. My thinking is there probably something turned that situation on, whether it was fully metabolic or a little genomic metabolic, whatever it was. Something turned that on because they didn't have enough life experience in 10 weeks to get that messed up. So then it goes back to, well, if I can do that with, say, the tendency towards diabetes, why can't I do that with a tendency towards a metabolic disturbance that would trigger a cancer, et cetera? And I think that that's going to be a huge area of research, and it could just be I'm not well read enough, but I know there's wisps of that out there as far as childhood cancers, but I don't know anyone's done a really great deep dive into it. But if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. And I think when you look at childhood cancers, that's got to be partly true. It may not be the whole explanation, but that's got to be partly true. Yeah.
It sounds like you're well read enough.
Still working on that.
All right. Let's just skip right on ahead to the fun stuff.
Right.
How would we look at natural substances and natural compounds as a quote unquote targeted therapy? What are they doing there in the context of everything we're talking about in terms of epigenetic expression?
Sure. I'll start at the end of the story, and that is, if you have high quality food nutritional compounds that we know about vitamins and minerals. We've heard about like fatty acids and all those things. But the other things are things like polyphenols, which are part of plants and all that. Each one of those things, which amazingly everything grandma probably told you to eat has all those things. Each one of those things has a place in the balance for feeding the cells in a way and feeding the biochemistry of the body to do all these processes in a way that runs as evenly as possible, and even is the game. So even is not simply we supply this B vitamin for this pathway or this mineral for the pathway. It's the pathway works, but then that pathway does these 8 other things, and we've got enough nutrients to do those 8 other things, and we don't overdo them, we don't underdo them. Polyphenols do stuff like help to regulate the little immune markers and regulate inflammation and all this other stuff, so that while we're doing business like detoxing and processing everything from the day, we don't inadvertently send some fuel to a cancer cell or do something to epigenetically turn bad stuff on. So really the end of the story is, and of course there's exceptions, like we talk about with childhood cancers, where the kids just got here and they have cancer, they haven't been eating anything. But when I talk to parents about prevention for themselves or their children, the first thing is getting as much high quality and clean as possible plant material into you as possible. Because if there's one superfood in the world, it's the plant kingdom. Really. And to go to the metabolic thing, and it makes some people upset, but I especially if they have, any disease state or potential disease state, I do warn them that, in the fruit end of the plant kingdom, there is a lot of sugar, and you have to really modulate that. And if you're doing metabolic therapies with cancer, we'll often take most fruits out for a while and, see where it goes. So we're talking mostly about vegetables there, and then, clean protein sources and clean fats. So the global thing is, if there's one message people could remember, it's as opposed to, and I understand the Western medicine mindset because that's where I came from, but as opposed to that mindset, which is we find penicillin to kill bacteria and the bacteria die, that's a great model for bacteria. That doesn't work with keeping our whole body healthy or keeping our cancer at bay. So in the food world, we want as well-rounded a package that provides macro and micronutrients so that we have balance. Because as soon as you get out of balance, somebody downstream is going to do something that will, through one of these mechanisms, either turn on an illness, weakness, an epigenetic thing for chronic illness, or maybe a cancer cell will get excited and do its thing, or maybe regular apoptosis or autophagy will stop, and then we get the cancer cells. So that's kind of the macro top-down version of nutrients, et cetera. But on the other end of the spectrum, and I say that first because people will think, well, okay, I'll get a SNP report and it'll tell me where I'm weak, and I'll just take those 3 B vitamins and then I'll be better, right? If you're not eating well, you can't supplement enough to create health. I mean, you can supplement to do specific things, but if you can't get your body's macro and micronutrition as clean and good and balanced as possible, you have too many cells to take pills to fix all that stuff. The reason that I will do supplementation with people, obviously we do it, is the diet things, we got that going, we're working on that, we're trying to do a little movement to get the mitochondria woken up and replicating and stuff. Now we take a look at the nutrients and say, just generally, you're probably not getting enough, from even really good quality foods, general trace minerals, B vitamins, and even some of the fat-soluble vitamins. And so we may need to do some global supplementation, because what those things do, a vitamin and mineral come together and they make an enzyme do its job efficiently. So if the enzyme, we go back to that methylation example, takes non-methylated folate, turns it into methylfolate, if that enzyme is missing its nutrient cofactors, it can't work. It's very slow. We slow that down, we get downstream problems. So if we know about their nutrigenomics, we may say, well, let's help these weak areas where you're very inefficient with, say, your B6 and your whatever, and we'll bring that up. But we always start broad and work down to that. But that's really what the nutrients are doing. You think about enzymes working. We stop living without enzymes working appropriately. But here's the other thing. Enzymes are heavily involved in our immune system. Our immune system is the reason we don't get cancer and infections every day. So if the enzyme systems are working poorly there because they don't have enough nutrients, things aren't going to go well. And then the other part really is the oxidative reductive balance in the body, and you got to have both. And again, kind of in our Western mindset for a while, I was like, well, oxidation sounds bad, so we shouldn't have any, and we should only have reduction and antioxidants. And it's like, well, no, we don't work that way. What we want enough of each, because without oxidation, your immune system stops working too. So oxidation is a protective mechanism of the body. The problem is in modern times, we have, for every one thing that is antioxidant, we have 100 exposures that are pro-oxidant. So we're a little out of balance in modern times. But again, keeping, and this has been even in the sort of the public forums, people are publishing, antioxidants are bad for you. And, it's like, no, again, you'd be dead with either one of too much. It's about balance. And yes, certainly if you've just gone through chemo or radiation and you're cleaning up after that, you need more of one than the other. If you're doing certain therapies like we do this to couple with metabolic therapy, diet therapy, and cancer, we may push one direction a little harder and then push the other direction. We always come back to balance. And if you're trying to prevent things, you really have to have all of these things working together, and it all starts with what you eat and the nutrients that you have. And most people, I know about this and I know how to do it, and I kind of have to work hard to keep that balance in what I eat, and I'm informed. So it's a big topic, but really comes back to think about what the body's sort of designed to do and how it's designed to use this sort of positive and negative forces like oxidation reduction or methylation, anti-methylation, all that stuff. And balance is where you don't get disease. And so anything you do to bring that, especially in prevention, is the way to go.
And so this balance you're talking about, that's the term of redox, correct?
Yes.
So, and real quick, when you talk about antioxidants versus oxidation, and especially when we're talking about an approach to cancer, and when you talk about when you talk about the metabolic approach, hyperbaric oxygen gets brought up, hydrogen peroxide, just oxidative stuff. And then obviously chemo, that's oxidative as well. What's your take on, from an implementation perspective, oxidative versus antioxidative when you're talking about therapies, particularly? Yeah. Like if I'm doing, hyperbaric oxygen, but then I'm also taking my little, antioxidant, just super berry drink right before I go in there. Am I canceling the two out? What's the deal there?
Yeah. That's an excellent question that gets asked every time I talk about hyperbaric oxygen or any of these other things. There's a spectrum of oxidative therapies. And certainly the most aggressive are things like radiation therapy and then the class of chemos that are oxidant chemos. So some chemos don't work that way, but the old ones, that's what they were going for. And the idea is we're going to go and we're going to create some kind of electron movement that just blows cells up, basically. That's maybe not biochemically totally correct, but that's the idea. It's kind of like carpet bombing and blowing stuff up. So it's kind of a blunt hammer. Now, one of the things that you get from any oxidative process, which took us a while to figure out, you get a downstream effect that is not related to blowing the cell up or something like that, but the process of the oxidation near the cells turns on chemical signals that wake the immune system up. Now, in chemo, this is at cross purposes because the chemo often doesn't do this because the chemo puts the immune system to sleep through other means. But if you do something like high dose vitamin C or ozone or something to create a peroxide surge in around the cells, you not only create an oxidative milieu which can harm many cancer cells, but it turns on immune cytokines and chemokines, these signalers, and they literally put the rest of the immune system on a higher alert. Now, you can overdo anything, and so you generally, and we actually learned this over time, we used to think, well, oxidative therapies are going to be the key. We're going to do them every day if we can, right? And what we found over time is when we did oxidative therapies 5 days a week, 7 days a week, we actually got diminishing returns with cancer. Whereas if we cut them down and did them pulsatile, we got better outcome. And there's many reasons for that, but I believe one of the reasons is if, kind of like the chemo example, I might turn on the oxidant surge, but if I put your immune system to sleep, the downstream signaling doesn't do you any good. If I give you an oxidative treatment, high dose vitamin C, say, or something like that today, and then I want that downstream positive immune effect to work, tomorrow would be a great day for you to have not doing that so that it has a chance to set in. Now, sometimes in aggressive things, we might stack them in a row, but that's clinically we see better effects with actually spacing treatment out. So let's say you go and you're going to do an oxidative treatment today, and you take your super antioxidant berry juice or whatever. If you take something orally that's antioxidant, it's probably not strong enough to shut off the oxidative effect of a high, like a high order therapy, like an IV therapy or something like that. What we don't do generally is give people like high dose IV vitamin C or an ozone treatment or something, and then give them an antioxidant right away, because then you're literally kind of shutting off what you want to do. But what we will do is we'll do it the next day.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing is hyperbaric, I purposely didn't talk about with oxidative therapies because it does do an oxidant part of the therapy, but hyperbaric does a whole bunch of other things that don't have anything to do with oxidation. And so, for instance, the molecule hypoxia-inducing factor, HIF1, that's manipulated by hyperbaric oxygen totally through it's not the oxidative, it's just the oxygen, in a direction that that fits into metabolic therapy, et cetera. So in hyperbaric oxygen, you get synergy actually with oxidative therapy and hyperbaric oxygen, but what you have to watch people for is that they don't get neurological or other side effects. Because there's an example where you use two strong oxidative therapies and you can create like neuropathy and other stuff like you would get with chemo, right? So what we do there is we adjust the dose of the hyperbaric, and then on the off day we give them antioxidants, have them drink their juice, that stuff, and then they don't get that. And it's a way to protect people from the therapy you're doing.
Very good, very good. Yeah, it's it's about where I've landed these days. So it's good to hear I didn't get there on accident.
Oh.
All right, and now let's jump back to natural stuff as it applies to what it is we're trying to do here from an epigenetic or genetic perspective. Do you just want to give a couple examples? Like I don't know if you can do this off the top of your head, but say something like sulforaphane. Are you able to on the spot just, or if I listed off curcumin EGCG, or no, EGGC? I always forget that one. The green tea. There you go.
Yeah.
Green tea.
Yeah.
Resveratrol. I don't know. However you want to do it, but can you just give an example of, all the different things that these things are going after that, can be beneficial?
Yeah. So that little group that you mentioned there, sulforaphanes, curcumin, EGCG, resveratrol, then there's boswellians, there's all sorts of other stuff. First thing to go back to my earlier point is they all come from food of some kind. And they tend to all come, like I said, from the plant spice kingdom. And that's why those things being in a person's diet is so preventive for the most part. And it's also why you don't want them heavily treated with pesticides and herbicides, because like all the good they do gets canceled out there. But here's the cool thing about them. They certainly in prevention, but what we're actually looking at now during cancer treatment, during different types of cancer treatment, is things such as sulforaphanes or curcuminoids or silymarins and EGCG, all these things you mentioned. They all have different targets that they go, and the thing I think is beautiful about all of them is they, unlike a lot of other nutritional items, let's say, they actually go and create balance, not only in oxidation reduction, antioxidant land, but they create balance in all of the little markers on your cells that are triggered by immune promoters or inhibitors. And all those little markers on the cells are that's kind of ground zero for cell communication. But the other thing is it can be ground zero if it's a cancer cell. Those little markers, they will often overexpress. And these natural things like a sulforaphane or curcuminoid or something like that often can go and inhibit the promoter areas on a cancer cell, but then they go to your normal cell and they just create this nice balance in immune function for the normal cell. And so they have this ability to kind of cross the aisle and do a different thing with a cancer cell than they would with a normal cell. So we actually I'll try and make it a quick example, but we were able during some cancer research with humans to try the idea of using very high doses of curcumin in an intravenous application with non-responsive cancer. So stage 4 cancer, no chemo work, no natural therapy work. There's no other options, and the people wanted to try it. And we found this, a safe pharmaceutical version, et cetera. And we actually had a large number of cases where at very, very high doses that are probably not practical right now clinically, but very high doses, you infuse it right in the system, and on their imaging, their metastases would either stop growing or regress. It's sort of a testament more to the fact that the curcuminoid has the ability to go and literally shut off the metastatic triggers. Now, does it work in No, it doesn't work in everybody. There's much more to the story than that. But it's one example of why these the polyphenol family, the good stuff from vegetables and spices work the way that they do. It's because while they're doing that to my tumor cell, my normal cell is just being kind of calmed down from them. It's not dying, or it's not doing anything bad. So those are very good. The other thing I'll just say, because I'm working on it, I'm excited about it, is the new trend outside of genetics, which you already let everyone know is bad failure in oncology. But outside of genetics and oncology, the other new trend is the use of biologic modifiers, biologic medications, so targeted therapies and stuff. So kind of different from old chemo. And that's, of course, those are gonna fail, not as bad as some of the genetic therapies, but they'll fail for the same reason. It's because we're targeting too much, and we're not caring about the rest of the cell. Well, the cool thing, I think, because I actually work in a hospital setting, and I consult where we do both sides of medicine equally, and we both have the same say. When we do biologic therapies at that hospital, we add polyphenol therapies in certain ways so that the biologic therapy does what it's supposed to and it doesn't mess anything else up. And so my hope is that someday, that we bring these things together. I will say, although I'm not sure where it's going to go, there is a drug version of curcumin. It's not as safe as real curcumin, but it's an oncology drug that's in the final steps of approval. So it's not like no one else has thought of this. But in order to get it patented, they had to make it not quite curcumin. That's not its chemical name, but it's basically that. So where we could use 10, 20, 30 times the dose safely of regular curcumin, they have to use 1/10 to 1/100 of the dose to keep it safe. But the reason I believe the reason they put like $1 million in developing the drug is there's just too much evidence to show it's probably going to make these other therapies work better. So if a drug company spends that much money to do that, there's something
there. Yeah. So when we talk about all these therapeutic applications of all these the compounds we just listed off and so much more, for the average guy or gal or parent out there kind of researching everything for themselves, and you see your naturopathic oncologist every once in a while, but you find out about new stuff every day. Are there any good resources in terms of determining what a therapeutic or pharmacologic dose or level of these types of things is in existence to the general public? Or where does Dr. Anderson go to get his dosing guidelines, and how does all that, because that's always the rub for people, is they can read articles about curcumin all day about how good it is for you, but then it's like, all right, I just got my bottle of curcumin, how much, or I would probably say whole food turmeric, but but then, okay, now how much do I take to try to meaningfully do something to this cancer without taking the whole bottle, and now I got to buy a new one tomorrow, it's
right. Yeah, that's probably one of the most difficult things, because as soon as someone writes a book or whatever that has a lot of that information in it, it gets outdated. Sometimes not, because it's something we've known a long time, but sometimes fairly quickly. There's actually a book that while there's things that need to be updated, and he does, it's available, it's not very expensive, and it's a great resource to start with. And I hope it's here on my bookshelf so I can get the right name. It's literally called Naturopathic Oncology by Dr. Neil McKinney, McKinney. You get it on Amazon. He's a colleague of mine. He's a real similar background of mine. He was a cancer researcher in the lab, and he became a naturopathic doctor, and he does cancer treatment. He is just a wealth of knowledge, and one of the only people that's written sort of an encyclopedic book aimed at really patient information, but doctors use it too. Like I said, I write something, he writes something, stuff gets outdated. So it's not always, not everything in there is that, but that's the one place you can kind of go and at least get a start. If you're looking for like the latest thing, and you want to look, because this will happen, you can, if you're doing searches, you can say curcumin oral human trial, and or human case report, and you'll literally find, instead of the 50 billion curcumin papers, you'll find a handful. And for instance, one just came out, and it was a single case, and it was just cheap curcumin the person was taking, and they took so many grams. It was orally, and then their colon cancer stopped growing, and all this. So you can find stuff like that. But what I do to find dosing is very long and laborious because I have to sift through all these things and find, because a lot of it's animal dosing, and then you have to do conversions and that sort of stuff. So I do like Dr. McKinney. Again, it's called Naturopathic Oncology and Encyclopedic Guide, Neil McKinney, on Amazon, and he just updated it, so it should be pretty good. And there's some better online resources that come on, but here's the other thing. What I would have told you about curcumin dosing 5 years ago would be completely different than I would tell you today. How I would tell you to mix, like you said, whole food turmeric, for one kind of goal, and some curcuminoid, more zippy special thing, different based on the kind of thing. But I think the other thing, and I'm just kind of saying this as talking to patients a lot, and I know there's patients and parents listening. Everything sounds wonderful when you read about it, and this happens to doctors too. You can't do and take everything. We all know that, and that's kind of our natural human drive, especially if it's your child you're talking about. So you have to do a lot of prioritization. You have to look at clean the environment, get after the food, look at what am I doing metabolically to keep keep a rein on the stuff Dr. Safry talked about. I think Ryan, your site and your resources are awesome. Books like Dr. McKinney's, where you've got somebody who really knows what they're talking about, giving advice, and then both check in with people who are trained to do this sort of thing, and then also people who've been down the road further, like Ryan. Because we all learn things the hard way, and you don't have to do the same thing over.
Do you have time to maybe just elaborate real quick on, with all the other metabolic and viral infections and all that stuff aside, when we are talking about all these different polyphenols, do you have, how does someone work out, like, how do you pick, like, your top 5 that you want to start with, and then how do you incorporate into, like, because obviously you start like looking for like the magic, the combination of this is going to be the 10 things that I'm going to do, but then you realize that it's kind of more of a of an ongoing thing. Your cancer just doesn't go away the next month, and or in most cases anyway. So, like, is there any rhyme or reason that you try to advise people on in terms of how to kind of how to make sense of all the options when it comes to the polyphenols and that sort of thing specifically?
I think well, there's 2 things I'd really like as take-home messages. One is, if you do come upon whatever it is, combination of you're doing this with a doctor, and you're doing this dietarily, and you're doing this with whatever else, and you're getting results, regression or stabilization, something positive going on. The first thing I can tell you from like all of my experience of going on 3 decades now doing this is, do not change and upset the apple cart when you are on kind of a winning horse, because much like every other thing, it won't win forever when cancer's around, because cancer finds ways around whatever. Now, it doesn't mean you have to throw everything out, but if you are getting results, because they do, results do happen, keep in that range and be critical and honest, and don't say, oh, I'm getting results when you're not. But I mean, if you're getting results, stick with what you're doing, because I've seen people do this and then they're like, okay, then they're on to the next cool looking thing, and that's not the right thing for your particular, cancer situation, and it quits working, and then they go back to the other thing and it doesn't work anymore. The other thing is, the corollary is, if it's not working, you need new ideas. So the way I kind of look at it is, if there's a pretty good group of treatments going on, and then I want to add, I do polyphenols with almost everybody, because you just can't go wrong, really. unless you're allergic to one or something. What I tend to do now is start with maybe 2 complementary ones at a little lower dose. So, like in an adult, I'm not taking, a fistful of curcumin every day. So, for instance, if it's a neurological type tumor, research in my experience would say curcumin and boswellia, which is an Ayurvedic herb that's it's very curcumin-like, but it loves the nervous system. If it's like a solid tumor in the periphery, breast, prostate, those sort of things, it might be curcumin and a sulforaphane, like a broccoli kind of supplement, something like that. And then there's other kind of specific things. But what I find is, yes, you can hit something with a giant hammer of polyphenol, like we did in the experiments with IV curcumin. We marinate the person literally, and their cancer stops growing great. But I mean, that's impractical long term. And what you really want is you want the complementary effect at lower doses. So I tend to like at 2 at lower doses. So let's say, for the sake of argument, you read a couple papers, you come up with, well, 4 grams of curcumin is great, and then you got 2 grams of boswellia is great. I usually would start people at 2 grams of curcumin, 1 gram of boswellia together, make sure they tolerate it, see if we get anywhere. If not, we kind of kick it up. If not, we move on and go something else. Do synergy, but you don't have to do everything. I will just say, because it sounds so good on paper, resveratrol is one of the best sounding things I've ever seen, and it's one of the worst things to get into people clinically, because usually it has to be in an alcohol to be absorbed, and that's not real practical for especially children. And so I don't start with resveratrol with anything, and I'm not down on it. It's an awesome molecule. It should get in you. That's the problem. Everything else that we mentioned earlier is the stuff I start with, and I usually do 2 at a time. And then, you go for effect, and if you're not getting effect, you either need more or you need to cover more bases. And like with Dr. Seyfried's information, which was probably, it overwhelms everyone, me included. What I can tell you from doing that with humans with cancer and trying to hit all the points, you literally have to come in to every point that affects the damaged metabolism, the damaged mitochondria, or the cancer will figure out a way around it. So it's about kind of making sure you're covering the bases.
Covering the bases. That's the gospel we try to preach around here. It's a good way to to wrap it up, I suppose. Do you have any final I usually ask everyone for their 3 golden rules on staying healthy and disease free, but I would just direct people to the YouTube channel, because we already got those out of you at the on-camp conference. Do you have any final thoughts or sentiments for anyone just going through cancer, be it for themselves or a loved one, that you'd like to take us out with, I suppose?
Yeah, I think it's obviously something I've dealt with for a long time. It is incredibly hard if you are the family member, caregiver, and often it's different hard if you're that person than it is if you personally have the cancer. Neither obviously is good. I think that keeping good counsel, keeping people who are feeding you different information that you can sort through, and then you maybe have a third sounding board to help sort their information out, not staying only with one person, especially if they're giving you a lot of negative information. And there's no way to make cancer super positive, but the way that you talk to people and the way that you characterize what's going to happen and the way that their brain receives it is a part of your immune response. And so, I will tell people, if there's a lot more oncologists in the world than there are people like me. If you got a bad vibe mojo with your oncologist and you're just not hitting it off, there's lots of other ones. Find one that you resonate with, because if that's a person that you need in your care team, you don't need to be at odds with that person. And if they're at odds with you for any reason, or it's just not working, get a different one. That is like you don't need any poison relationships. And I say that because I've seen, and it's not just on, you can have natural health people be poisoned, whatever. You can have family members be poisoned. You got to really control that, because that is that's like the worst epigenetic stress in the world, is negativity and ignorance of stuff that could probably help you. And if anybody is keeping you from the right solution, whether they're from, the natural side or the standard side or some other side, they're not good for you, and that's why, you really need to surround yourself with a good team. And if it's you, it's hard enough to stay up and, with it. If it's your child, or you're doing, caring for your sister or something like that, it's really hard. And the caregiver needs care. And
look at that. He managed to put a nice little emotional bookend onto all this. All this sciencey information. That was really great. It was really great. Thank you for taking it out that way, Dr. Paul Anderson. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. All right.
Did you get all that? I hope you did. Go back and listen again if not, because somehow I doubt your oncologist is going to be learning this stuff anytime soon, so it is up to you to get it for yourself, and Dr. Anderson is hands down the best possible guy to be learning it from. One quick note of clarification: when we were talking about the timing of antioxidants and pro-oxidants, Dr. Anderson made a comment about not being concerned with oral antioxidants as the same day as a pro-oxidant therapy, but then went on to say that antioxidants on the same day as pro-oxidants would not be a good idea. He was talking about a stronger delivery method of antioxidants, such as intravenously, as opposed to our hypothetical super berry drink. Also, I have no clue why, but I forgot to ask Dr. Anderson where he would like to point people to learn more about what he's doing or anything of that nature, so I do need to tell you that I'm very happy to say that he does have a book coming out in the fall of 2018 that he's co-writing with Dr. Mark Stingler, and that will be titled Outside the Box Cancer Therapies, so keep an eye out for that one. We'll be sure to have one or both of them back on as we get closer to the release date. If you are in the greater Seattle area or even further out and have a tough case of something you're looking to resolve, I know of no better place than Dr. Anderson's clinic, Advanced Medical Therapies, and you can find that simply at advancedmedicaltherapies.com. I can say from personal experience that the service and wisdom in that clinic is second to none. And if you're not in the area and just want to learn more from this great teacher, you can do so at consultdra.com. All right, I really hope you got some great information out of this episode with Dr. Paul Anderson. If you did, be sure to share it out with all of your friends so they can get the same healing info at mykidcurescancer.com/Paul-Anderson. And Anderson is spelled with an O-N at the end. That's also where you can get the full review article and any points on how the interview applies to childhood cancer, along with the links to all resources that were brought up during the interview. And while you're there, again, be sure to get onto the mailing list if you haven't already to get the summary of everything we put out for the week and anything else that we think might be helpful to you. And when you do, of course, we will send you our quick ebook, The 10 Things You Need to Know If Your Child Has Been Diagnosed with Cancer. Music was provided by the Fat Rat and the Tasty Network, and all production and editing was done by my wonderful wife, Teddy Sternagel. Lord willing, we'll see you next week with Dr. Z himself, Dr. Eric Zielinski, where we'll be talking about all things essential oils and biblical health as they pertain to cancer, of course. That's all for me. This is Ryan Sternagel signing out. God bless and Godspeed.